In the year 71 BC, along the banks of the Siler River in southern Italy, two armies faced each other in what would become one of the most decisive battles in Roman history. On one side stood the disciplined legions of Rome, led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Republic. On the other, a ragtag force of escaped slaves, gladiators, and desperate men commanded by a Thracian warrior whose name would echo through eternity: Spartacus. This was no ordinary rebellion. For nearly 3 years, this former gladiator had done the impossible. He had united the oppressed masses of Rome and turned them into a military force that brought the mighty Republic to its knees. The question that haunted every Roman citizen was simple yet terrifying. Could slaves truly defeat their masters? The answer would reshape the very foundations of Roman society and reveal truths about power, freedom, and human dignity that resonate to this day. What began as a desperate escape from a gladiator school in Capua had evolved into something far more dangerous, a revolution that threatened the economic backbone of Roman civilization. But how did a handful of gladiators transform into an army of over 100,000 followers? And what drove ordinary people to risk everything for a chance at freedom? The story of Spartacus is not just about one man's quest for liberty. It's about the moment when the oppressed dared to dream of a world without chains. To understand the magnitude of what Spartacus achieved, we must first journey into the heart of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. This was Rome at its most contradictory, a civilization that spoke eloquently of virtue and honor while building its prosperity on the backs of millions of enslaved human beings. The Republic had grown fat on conquest, and with each victory came waves of captives destined for the slave markets of Italy. Roman society was a pyramid of power, with citizens at the top and slaves forming the massive foundation that supported everything above. Yet even among citizens, equality was a myth. The patricians, Rome's ancient nobility, controlled most of the wealth and political offices, while the plebeians, the common citizens, struggled for representation and economic security. Below them were the freedmen, former slaves who had earned or bought their liberty but remained bound by social limitations. And at the bottom, bearing the weight of this entire system, were the slaves. The numbers were staggering. By some estimates, slaves comprised nearly 40% of Italy's population. They worked in mines that killed them within years, on vast agricultural estates called latifundia, in urban workshops, and in the homes of the wealthy. They built Rome's roads, constructed its monuments, and died for its entertainment. The Romans had created a machine of human exploitation so vast and efficient that it had become essential to their way of life. But slavery in Rome was not uniform. Household slaves who served wealthy families might live relatively comfortable lives, some even becoming trusted advisors or skilled artisans. Greek slaves, prized for their education, often served as tutors and secretaries. At the other extreme were the agricultural slaves who labored in chains under brutal overseers, and the gladiators who faced death for the amusement of crowds. It was among these most desperate souls that the seeds of rebellion would take root. The gladiator schools, or ludi, were perhaps the cruelest institutions in a system built on cruelty. Here, men were trained to kill each other with artistic precision. They were fed well and given medical care, not from compassion, but because they were valuable investments. A skilled gladiator could cost as much as a luxury villa. Yet despite the fame some achieved, they remained property, their lives entirely at the mercy of their owners. Rome's political system was equally complex and increasingly unstable. The Republic was theoretically governed by the Senate and the Roman people, Senatus, Populusque, Romanus. In reality, a small elite of wealthy families controlled most decisions through a combination of tradition, money, and intimidation. The consulship, Rome's highest office, rotated annually between competing aristocrats, while the people's assemblies could be manipulated through bribery and mob tactics. This was the age of titans like Pompey the Great, who had earned his surname through military conquests that stretched from Spain to the east, and Gaius Julius Caesar, whose political ambitions would soon reshape the Mediterranean world. But perhaps no figure better embodied the contradictions of late Republican Rome than Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose vast wealth came from real estate speculation, silver mines worked by slaves, and a private fire brigade that would only put out fires after negotiating the purchase price of burning buildings from desperate owners. The Roman military system, too, was in transition. The legions that had conquered the Mediterranean were no longer the citizen farmers of earlier centuries. Military service had become a career for the landless poor, creating armies more loyal to their generals than to the state. Veterans expected land grants and bonuses, while commanders sought wealth and glory to fuel their political ambitions. This militarization of politics would have profound consequences for the Republic's future. Roman religion permeated every aspect of life, from the state ceremonies that honored Jupiter Optimus Maximus to the household shrines where families honored their ancestors. The Romans were intensely superstitious, consulting auguries before major decisions and believing that the favor of the gods determined their success. Yet they were also pragmatically tolerant, incorporating the deities of conquered peoples into their pantheon. This religious flexibility would prove crucial when dealing with diverse slave populations who brought their own beliefs and traditions. The economy of the Republic was increasingly dependent on slave labor and tribute from conquered territories. Wealthy Romans invested in vast agricultural estates worked by slaves, producing grain, wine, and olive oil for urban markets. The influx of wealth from conquest had created a consumer culture among the elite, who competed in displays of luxury that would have shocked earlier generations of Romans. Magnificent villas, elaborate banquets, and increasingly spectacular public games reflected a society drunk on success and seemingly unaware of the fundamental instabilities building beneath the surface. But perhaps the most important aspect of Roman culture for our story was its complex relationship with honor and courage. Romans prized virtues, courage in battle, steadfastness in adversity, and loyalty to one's obligations. Yet they applied these values selectively, celebrating the bravery of citizens while denying the humanity of those they enslaved. This contradiction would prove pivotal when confronted with a slave who embodied Roman virtues better than many Romans themselves. Into this world of power and oppression, wealth and desperation, came a warrior from the mountains of Thrace whose name was Spartacus. The exact details of his early life remain shrouded in mystery, but we know he was likely born free among the fierce tribes that inhabited the region between the Black Sea and the Aegean. The Thracians were renowned warriors, serving as mercenaries and auxiliary troops throughout the Mediterranean world. Their reputation for ferocity in battle was matched only by their fierce independence, qualities that would serve Spartacus well in the trials ahead. The transformation of Spartacus from free warrior to enslaved gladiator to revolutionary leader reveals the brutal realities that lay beneath Rome's civilized veneer. Like countless others from the barbarian lands beyond Rome's frontiers, Spartacus probably first encountered Roman power as a soldier. The Thracian tribes frequently served as auxiliaries in Roman armies, their cavalry and light infantry skills complementing the heavy infantry tactics of the legions. But service to Rome was a double-edged sword for barbarian warriors. While it offered opportunities for wealth and advancement, it also exposed them to the calculated ruthlessness of Roman politics and warfare. Whether Spartacus deserted from Roman service, was captured in battle, or fell victim to some other misfortune, he eventually found himself in chains destined for the slave markets of Italy. The journey from the mountains of Thrace to the gladiator schools of Capua would have been a nightmare of degradation and loss. Captured warriors were stripped of their names, their identities, their very humanity. They were examined like livestock, their muscles tested, their scars evaluated for signs of combat experience. The strongest and most promising were selected for gladiator training, a fate that guaranteed a life of violence but offered the slim possibility of fame and eventual freedom. The gladiator school at Capua, owned by Lentulus Batiatus, was one of the most prestigious in Italy. Located in the heart of Campania, a region famous for its fertile soil and wealthy estates, Capua had long been associated with luxury and excess. The school trained fighters for the games in Rome and other major cities, producing gladiators who could command high fees and draw massive crowds. Life in the school was a study in contradictions that reflected the broader paradoxes of Roman slavery. The gladiators were fed the best food: barley, beans, dried fruit, and meat to build muscle and stamina. They received medical care from skilled doctors who understood anatomy better than most physicians of their time. Their weapons and armor were crafted by master smiths, often more elaborate and expensive than anything carried by Roman soldiers. Yet they were also prisoners, locked in cells at night, watched constantly by guards and subject to brutal punishments for any sign of disobedience. They trained to kill but were forbidden to die except at appointed times and places. They were celebrities who could never truly be free. The psychological pressure of this existence, living as a pampered prisoner, preparing for death as entertainment, broke many men completely, not Spartacus. Something in the Thracian's character refused to bend beneath this calculated dehumanization. Perhaps it was the memory of freedom in the mountains of his homeland, or the warrior code that had shaped his youth, or simply an innate understanding that some things mattered more than survival. Whatever the source, Spartacus began to see beyond his individual fate to something larger and more dangerous: the possibility of collective action. The other gladiators came to recognize something different about the Thracian. He wasn't merely surviving, he was planning. His eyes, according to later accounts, held a quality that unnerved even the hardened guards. Not the desperation of a trapped animal, but the cold calculation of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He began to speak quietly with other gladiators, not about escape, many had dreamed of that, but about something far more radical: revolution. Among his earliest converts were two Gallic warriors, Crixus and Venomius, whose own journeys to the gladiator school paralleled his own. The Gauls had fought Romans before, in the wars that had reduced their proud tribes to tributaries and slaves. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the full scope of Roman oppression and the price of defeat. Together, these three began to forge the nucleus of what would become the greatest slave rebellion in ancient history. But what made Spartacus different from other would-be rebel leaders was his ability to see beyond the immediate goal of escape. While others might dream of fleeing Italy and returning to their homelands, Spartacus began to envision something more ambitious and more dangerous: not just freedom for a few, but liberation for the masses of enslaved people throughout the Roman heartland. This vision would prove both his greatest strength and ultimately his fatal weakness. The gladiator school became a university of revolution, where men who had fought in armies across the ancient world shared their knowledge of Roman military tactics, logistics, and weaknesses. Spartacus learned that Rome's power, while vast, was not infinite. The legions were scattered across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, dealing with rebellions, invasions, and civil wars. Italia itself was defended by relatively few regular troops, relying instead on the assumption that the oppressed populations would never unite against their masters. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. As months passed, the conspiracy grew more sophisticated. The gladiators developed codes and signals, identified sympathetic slaves in the surrounding area, and began to stockpile weapons and supplies. They studied the routines of their guards, mapped escape routes, and planned for the chaos that would follow their break for freedom. Most importantly, they began to think not just as individual warriors seeking personal liberty, but as the vanguard of a movement that could transform the ancient world. The spark that would ignite this revolution came in the spring of 73 BC, triggered by a decision that revealed the casual cruelty underlying the gladiator system. Lentulus Batiatus had decided to stage a special exhibition, selecting certain gladiators to fight to the death for the entertainment of wealthy guests. Among those chosen was Spartacus himself, a selection that would prove to be one of history's most costly mistakes. The night before the scheduled fights, as guards made their final preparations and guests gathered in anticipation of blood sport, Spartacus gave the signal his conspirators had been waiting for. The rebellion that would shake the foundations of the Roman world was about to begin. But could a handful of escaped gladiators really challenge the greatest military power the world had ever known? The answer would depend not just on Spartacus's leadership and fighting skills, but on his ability to tap into the vast reservoir of resentment and desperation that simmered beneath the surface of Roman society. The true test of his revolution would come not in the gladiator school of Capua, but in the fields and villages where millions of slaves lived and worked and dreamed of freedom. The breakout from the gladiator school at Capua began not with swords and shields, but with the most mundane of weapons, kitchen knives and cooking spits. In a move that demonstrated both desperation and tactical brilliance, Spartacus and his fellow conspirators had realized that their carefully maintained gladiator equipment would be too heavily guarded to access during their escape attempt. Instead, they would have to rely on improvised weapons and the element of surprise. On that fateful day in 73 BC, as the wealthy spectators of Capua prepared for their afternoon of blood sport, 78 gladiators launched their bid for freedom. The exact details of how they overcame their guards remain unclear, but ancient sources tell us that the revolt began in the school's kitchen, where the conspirators armed themselves with whatever they could find. These men, trained to kill with artistic precision, proved devastatingly effective even with improvised weapons. The breakout succeeded because it combined careful planning with the explosive fury of desperate men who had nothing left to lose. The guards, accustomed to managing prisoners who fought only when commanded and died on schedule, were completely unprepared for organized resistance. The gladiators moved through the school systematically, freeing their comrades and securing real weapons from the training armories. But Spartacus understood that escape from the school was only the beginning. 78 men, no matter how skilled, could never stand against the power of Rome. They needed to move quickly, gather followers, and find a defensible position before the Romans could organize a response. The decision of where to go would prove crucial to everything that followed. Rather than scattering to the winds as most escaped slaves did, Spartacus led his band to Mount Vesuvius, the great volcano that loomed over the Bay of Naples. This choice revealed the strategic mind that would make him such a formidable opponent. Vesuvius was close enough to Capua to reach quickly, but its slopes provided natural fortifications that could protect a small force against larger armies. More importantly, the mountain's slopes were dotted with slave-worked estates whose populations might be sympathetic to the rebellion. The psychological impact of the gladiators' escape rippled across Campania like an earthquake. For generations, Romans had lived with the comfortable assumption that their slaves, however numerous, would never unite in effective resistance. Individual escapes happened regularly, of course, but organized rebellion was considered almost impossible. The success of the Capua breakout shattered this illusion and sent shockwaves through every slaveholding community in Italy. As news of the revolt spread, something unprecedented began to happen. Slaves from the surrounding estates began to slip away from their masters and make their way toward Vesuvius. These were not trained warriors, but agricultural workers, household servants, and craftsmen. People who had lived their entire lives under the lash and had never dared dream of freedom. Yet something about Spartacus and his band of gladiators gave them hope that resistance was possible. The transformation of these desperate refugees into a fighting force would test every aspect of Spartacus's leadership abilities. The escaped gladiators were warriors by training and experience, accustomed to discipline and violence. The agricultural slaves who joined them had been systematically brutalized and demoralized, taught from childhood that resistance was futile and rebellion meant death. Forging these diverse groups into a cohesive army would require not just military genius, but an understanding of human psychology that few commanders in history have possessed. Spartacus approached this challenge with remarkable insight. Rather than simply issuing orders, he began to teach his followers that they were no longer slaves, but free men and women fighting for their liberty. He organized them not as a mob, but as an army, with clear chains of command, specific duties, and shared responsibilities. Most importantly, he gave them victories. The first test came sooner than expected. Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor tasked with suppressing the revolt, arrived with a force of about 3,000 men. Not regular legions, but hastily assembled militia and local troops. Glaber was a politician seeking military glory, not a professional soldier, and he made the fatal mistake of underestimating his opponents. He positioned his forces at the base of Vesuvius, effectively besieging the rebels on the mountain's slopes. What happened next became one of the most famous tactical maneuvers in military history. Spartacus and his men appeared trapped on the mountain, with only one narrow path down that Glaber's forces could easily defend. But the Thracian had noticed something his Roman opponent had missed. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered with wild vines whose tough, flexible stems could be woven into ropes. Under cover of darkness, Spartacus's men began crafting rope ladders from the vines. Rather than attempting to break through Glaber's defenses at the expected point, they rappelled down the sheer back face of the mountain, circled behind the Roman position, and launched a surprise attack at dawn. Glaber's troops, caught completely off guard, fled in panic, leaving behind their weapons, supplies, and most importantly, their reputation. The victory at Vesuvius was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological earthquake that transformed the nature of the rebellion. Word spread throughout southern Italy that slaves had not merely escaped, but had defeated a Roman army in open battle. For enslaved people who had never imagined that resistance was possible, this news arrived like a revelation. If gladiators and agricultural workers could beat trained Roman soldiers, perhaps freedom was not just a dream but an achievable goal. The flood of new recruits that followed the victory created both opportunities and challenges for Spartacus. His army swelled from hundreds to thousands, then tens of thousands, as slaves abandoned estates across Campania and Apulia to join the revolt. These weren't just agricultural workers now, but urban craftsmen, household servants, shepherds, and even some free peasants whose economic circumstances were little better than slavery. Managing this diverse and rapidly growing force required organizational skills that few ancient commanders possessed. Spartacus had to create systems for feeding, housing, and training his followers while maintaining military discipline and planning for future operations. He established forges to produce weapons, workshops to repair equipment, and training camps to teach basic military skills to recruits who had never held weapons. Perhaps most challenging was the question of long-term strategy. The rebellion had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, but success brought its own problems. What was the ultimate goal? Some followers wanted to march on Rome itself and burn the city that had enslaved them. Others preferred to plunder the wealthy estates of southern Italy and then escape to freedom beyond Rome's borders. Still others dreamed of creating a permanent free territory where former slaves could build new lives. Spartacus found himself balancing these competing visions while facing the growing certainty that Rome would respond to the rebellion with overwhelming force. The victory at Vesuvius had been won against a single praetor with hastily assembled troops. Soon he would face professional legions commanded by Rome's most experienced generals. The question was whether his rapidly growing but largely untrained army could stand against the military machine that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The answer would depend not just on tactics and weapons, but on the deeper question of what his followers were truly fighting for, and what they were willing to sacrifice to achieve it. In the months following their victory at Vesuvius, Spartacus's rebel army underwent a transformation that defied every assumption Romans held about the nature of their enslaved populations. What began as a desperate escape by 78 gladiators had evolved into a military force that numbered in the tens of thousands and controlled vast swaths of southern Italy. But this was no ordinary army, and the challenges Spartacus faced in organizing it were unlike anything in military history. The diversity of his followers was both the rebellion's greatest strength and its most persistent weakness. At the core were the original gladiators, professional fighters who understood discipline, tactics, and the brutal realities of combat. Around them gathered Gallic and Germanic warriors who had been enslaved after their tribes' defeats by Roman legions. Men who retained memories of free warrior cultures and knowledge of military formations. But the majority of Spartacus's army consisted of agricultural slaves who had lived their entire lives under systematic oppression. These men and women had been taught from birth that resistance was futile, that Romans were inherently superior, and that their only value lay in their labor. Breaking through these psychological chains proved as challenging as forging them into effective fighters. Spartacus approached this monumental task with a combination of practical wisdom and inspirational leadership that revealed dimensions of his character that went far beyond mere tactical brilliance. He understood that people who had been dehumanized for years or decades needed more than weapons and training. They needed to rediscover their own worth and dignity. The rebel leader established what amounted to a new society on the slopes of Vesuvius and in the territories his army controlled. Rather than simply organizing a military force, he created institutions that gave his followers a taste of the freedom they were fighting for. Decisions about major operations were made in council meetings where former slaves could speak as equals. Plunder from captured Roman estates was distributed according to need rather than military rank. Most revolutionary of all, the rebellion began to attract not just slaves but free peasants and urban poor whose lives differed little from slavery. The logistics of maintaining such a force would have challenged even experienced Roman quartermasters. An army of 70,000 to 100,000 people, the numbers our sources suggest, required enormous amounts of food, weapons, clothing, and shelter. Unlike traditional armies, this force included thousands of women and children who had fled slavery with their husbands and fathers. They needed to eat every day, required medical care when injured or sick, and had to be protected during military operations. Spartacus solved these problems through a combination of military conquest and economic innovation that demonstrated remarkable adaptability. His forces captured Roman supply depots, raided wealthy estates, and established their own workshops and forges. Skilled craftsmen among the former slaves produced weapons and equipment that often surpassed the quality of standard Roman military gear. The rebellion even began minting its own coins, creating a monetary system that facilitated trade with sympathetic merchants and free communities. The military training program Spartacus established was perhaps his greatest achievement as a leader. Roman military success depended heavily on discipline, coordination, and the ability to maintain formation under pressure. These were precisely the qualities that had been systematically beaten out of enslaved populations through generations of oppression. Teaching former slaves to fight as disciplined soldiers required not just instruction in weapons and tactics, but a fundamental reimagining of their relationship to authority and power. The gladiators served as sergeants and officers in this training program. passing on their knowledge of combat techniques and weapon handling. But Spartacus insisted that military discipline be based on mutual respect rather than fear, a radical departure from both Roman military tradition and the plantation system that had previously governed his followers' lives. Soldiers were expected to obey orders during combat, but they retained the right to voice opinions during planning sessions and to elect their own immediate commanders. This democratic approach to military organization created fierce loyalty among Spartacus's followers, but also generated conflicts that would ultimately contribute to the rebellion's downfall. The Gallic contingent, led by Crixus, increasingly chafed under Spartacus's strategic caution and favored more aggressive operations against Roman cities. The Germanic fighters had their own cultural traditions and military preferences. Managing these different factions required diplomatic skills that even experienced Roman politicians might have envied. The rebellion's success in southern Italy created a strategic dilemma that would haunt Spartacus throughout his campaign. His original plan, if indeed he had one, probably involved escaping from Italy entirely and returning to his native Thrace, or helping other followers reach their homelands. But the massive response to his call for rebellion created new possibilities and new responsibilities. With an army of 100,000 former slaves under his command, he possessed the power to challenge Roman authority throughout Italy. The question was whether he should use that power to seek escape or to fight for permanent change. The debate over strategy came to a head during the winter of 73 to 72 BC, when Spartacus's army had established secure winter quarters in the mountains of southern Italy. Some of his followers, led by Crixus, argued for an immediate march on Rome itself. The capital was lightly defended, they pointed out, with most legions committed to campaigns in Spain, Asia Minor, and other frontier regions. A swift strike might capture the city and trigger uprisings throughout the empire. Spartacus rejected this strategy, demonstrating the strategic thinking that made him such a formidable opponent. He understood that capturing Rome would unite all Romans against the rebellion and bring down the full weight of the empire's military power. Even if his forces could take the city, they lacked the resources and political structure necessary to hold it against the inevitable counterattack. Better to maintain their mobility and strike at Rome's economic interest while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that would allow the Romans to bring their superior numbers and organization to bear. This disagreement led to the first major split in the rebel army. Crixus and approximately 30,000 followers separated from the main force, choosing to ravage the Roman countryside in Apulia, while Spartacus led the remainder north toward the Alps. The division would prove catastrophic for both forces, as it allowed the Romans to defeat them separately rather than facing the full strength of the united rebellion. But before examining the consequences of this strategic error, it's worth considering what Spartacus had already accomplished. In less than 2 years, a handful of escaped gladiators had created an army that controlled territories larger than many Roman provinces. They had defeated multiple Roman forces, captured cities, and established an alternative society that demonstrated the potential for life beyond slavery. The rebellion had shown enslaved people throughout the Mediterranean world that resistance was possible and had shaken the foundations of the economic system that supported Roman civilization. However, military success had not resolved the fundamental contradictions within the rebel movement. Was this a revolution aimed at overthrowing Roman society, or an elaborate escape attempt by people seeking to return to their homelands? Could former slaves truly create a stable alternative to Roman rule? Or would their movement inevitably fragment under the weight of cultural differences and competing ambitions? These questions would be answered in blood on the battlefields of northern Italy, where Spartacus would face his greatest test yet. The stage was set for the climactic phase of the rebellion, where tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership would no longer be enough. Now Spartacus would need to outfight, outthink, and outlast the full military might of Rome itself. If you're enjoying this journey through Roman history, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more untold stories of empires, battles, and philosophy to life. The Roman Senate's initial response to the Spartacus Rebellion reveals much about how the ruling class viewed the enslaved populations that supported their civilization. The first commanders sent against the rebels, men like Gaius Claudius Glaber, were not Rome's most experienced generals, but political opportunists seeking easy military victories to advance their careers. The assumption was that any organized resistance by slaves would collapse at the first sight of Roman eagles and disciplined troops. This complacency evaporated with shocking speed as news arrived of defeat after defeat. Glaber's humiliation at Vesuvius was followed by the rout of Publius Varinius, another praetor whose forces were scattered by Spartacus's increasingly confident and capable army. When Varinius himself barely escaped capture, losing his horse, his lictors, and his dignity in a chaotic retreat, it became clear that Rome faced something unprecedented in its history. The Senate's response was swift and comprehensive. They declared a state of emergency, a tumultus that suspended normal legal procedures and authorized extraordinary measures to suppress the rebellion. More importantly, they began mobilizing the kind of military force that had conquered Carthage, subdued Gaul, and dominated the Eastern Mediterranean. The age of sending ambitious politicians with makeshift armies was over. Now Rome would deploy the full weight of its military machine. The man chosen to lead this effort was Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose selection would prove one of the most consequential decisions in the rebellion's history. Crassus was not Rome's most celebrated general. That distinction belonged to Pompey the Great, who was campaigning in Spain against the rebel Quintus Sertorius. Nor was he the most politically powerful. Julius Caesar was rising rapidly through the ranks of Roman politics. But Crassus possessed advantages that made him uniquely suited to the challenges ahead. First, and most importantly, he was spectacularly wealthy. Ancient sources suggest that Crassus's fortune exceeded 200 million sestertii, making him possibly the richest man in Roman history. This wealth allowed him to equip and supply armies without waiting for slow-moving Senate appropriations. When Rome needed immediate action against Spartacus, Crassus could move faster than the normal machinery of government allowed. His wealth also gave him extensive business interests that were directly threatened by the rebellion. Crassus owned silver mines worked by slave labor, vast agricultural estates throughout Italy, and urban properties in Rome itself. Unlike aristocrats whose wealth came primarily from land and political office, Crassus understood that his fortune depended on maintaining the system of slave labor that Spartacus threatened to destroy. For him, suppressing the rebellion was not just a matter of public duty, but of economic survival. Perhaps most crucially, Crassus approached the rebellion with the cold calculation of a businessman rather than the hot-blooded honor-seeking of typical Roman generals. He understood that Spartacus was not merely a military problem, but a comprehensive threat to Roman society that required systematic solutions. Where other commanders had sought quick victories and personal glory, Crassus planned for a methodical campaign that would not only defeat the rebels but eliminate any possibility of future uprisings. The army Crassus assembled reflected both his resources and his strategic thinking. Rather than relying solely on hastily recruited Italian allies or inexperienced volunteers, he demanded and received 8 full legions of Roman citizens, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 seasoned troops. These were men who had served in previous campaigns, understood Roman discipline and tactics, and could be trusted to maintain formation under pressure. But Crassus's most significant innovation was his approach to military discipline. The Roman army had suffered a series of humiliating defeats against slave rebels, undermining morale and creating dangerous precedents. Crassus responded by reviving decimation, a punishment so severe that it had not been used for generations. When one of his legions broke and fled during an early encounter with Spartacus's forces, Crassus selected every 10th man by lot and had them beaten to death by their comrades. The psychological impact of this brutal discipline was immediate and profound. Crassus's troops understood that their commander feared no one, not even his own soldiers, and that cowardice would be punished more severely than death in battle. But the decimation also sent a message to Roman society as a whole. The rebellion would be suppressed regardless of the cost, and no consideration of mercy or political advantage would interfere with that goal. While Crassus organized his campaign in Rome, Spartacus faced the consequences of his army's division. The separation of Crixus's forces had seemed manageable when the rebels controlled most of southern Italy and faced only divided Roman opposition. But as winter ended and campaigning season began, the strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. Crixus, leading his 30,000 followers in raids throughout Apulia, encountered the advance elements of Crassus's army under the command of his lieutenant Mummius. The Battle of Garganus would demonstrate the difference between the eager but inexperienced troops the rebels had faced previously and the disciplined veterans now arrayed against them. The Gallic leaders' forces fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by Roman tactical superiority and the coordination that came from years of professional military training. Crixus himself fell in the fighting, along with thousands of his followers. The survivors scattered, some attempting to rejoin Spartacus, while others simply fled into the mountains to avoid capture and crucifixion. The death of Crixus was both a military disaster and a psychological blow that reverberated throughout the rebellion. The Gallic warrior had been one of Spartacus's most trusted lieutenants and one of the original conspirators in the Capua breakout. His loss demonstrated that Roman military power, when properly organized and led, remained formidable despite previous defeats, but the impact went deeper than mere military calculations. Crixus had represented the faction within the rebellion that favored aggressive action against Roman cities and institutions. His death left Spartacus as the undisputed leader of the remaining rebel forces, but it also eliminated a voice that had pushed for bold action when caution might have meant safety. News of the disaster at Garganus reached Spartacus as he moved north through central Italy with the main rebel army. The strategic situation was now fundamentally different from what it had been just months before. Instead of facing divided Roman forces led by inexperienced commanders, he would soon confront Crassus's professional legions in a campaign that would test every aspect of his leadership and military genius. The rebellion had reached its critical moment. Everything Spartacus had accomplished, the liberation of 100,000 slaves, the creation of an alternative society, the demonstration that resistance was possible, now hung in the balance. The next phase of the campaign would determine whether the rebellion would achieve its goals of escape and freedom, or whether it would become merely another footnote in Rome's bloody history of suppressing those who dared to challenge its authority. The machine of Roman military power was finally awakening, and its focus was entirely fixed on the Thracian gladiator who had dared to dream of freedom. As spring arrived in 72 BC, Spartacus found himself leading approximately 70,000 followers northward through the Italian peninsula, pursuing a strategy that would either secure their freedom or lead to their destruction. The death of Crixus had eliminated one major faction within the rebellion, but it had also demonstrated that Rome was now committed to suppressing the revolt with unprecedented force and determination. The Thracians' decision to march north toward the Alps represented a fundamental shift in the rebellion's character and objectives. No longer could this be seen as simply a slave revolt aimed at plundering Roman estates and cities. This was an exodus, a massive migration of enslaved people seeking escape from Roman territory entirely. If successful, it would represent the largest loss of slave property in Roman history, and establish a precedent that could inspire similar movements throughout the empire. But the northern march also revealed the growing contradictions within Spartacus's army. Many of his followers, particularly those who had joined more recently, had no desire to leave Italy. For agricultural slaves who had spent their entire lives working Roman estates, the idea of crossing the Alps into the barbarian lands beyond was as terrifying as remaining in slavery. They had fought for freedom, not for exile. These tensions came to a head as the rebel army moved through central Italy, achieving victories that only complicated Spartacus's strategic situation. At Picenum, his forces defeated another Roman army, capturing vast quantities of supplies and weapons. At Mutina, they overwhelmed the local garrison and briefly occupied one of northern Italy's most important cities. Each success brought new recruits, escaped slaves, sympathetic free peasants, and even some Roman deserters, but also increased the burden of maintaining such a massive force. The psychological impact of these victories rippled far beyond the immediate military situation. Throughout Italy, enslaved populations watched with amazement as their fellow bondsmen not only survived, but thrived in open rebellion against their masters. On estates across the peninsula, whispered conversations began about escape, resistance, and the possibility that freedom might be achievable after all. Roman society, meanwhile, began to fracture under the pressure of sustained military failure. The wealthy elite who owned vast slave populations lived in constant fear of uprising. Urban residents worried about food supplies as agricultural production disrupted by the rebellion led to shortages and price increases. Most dangerously for the Republic's long-term stability, the rebellion had demonstrated that Rome's vaunted military superiority could be challenged by determined opponents using unconventional tactics. As Spartacus approached the Alps, he faced what should have been his moment of triumph. The mountain passes lay open before him, offering escape routes into Gaul where his followers could disperse to their homelands or establish new settlements beyond Roman reach. His army remained largely intact despite months of campaigning, and Roman pursuit had been hampered by the rebellion's superior mobility and local knowledge. Yet at this crucial moment, Spartacus made the decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Instead of crossing the Alps to safety, he turned his army south, back toward the heart of Roman territory. The reasons for this fateful choice remain one of history's most debated questions, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Ancient sources suggest several possible explanations for Spartacus's decision. Some claim that his followers refused to leave Italy, preferring the familiar landscapes of their enslavement to the unknown dangers of barbarian lands. Others suggest that success had made the rebels overconfident, convincing them that they could achieve total victory rather than mere escape. Still others propose that Spartacus himself had been corrupted by power and no longer desired simple freedom but sought to establish a permanent kingdom in southern Italy. The most likely explanation combines elements of all these theories while recognizing the impossible position Spartacus faced as a leader. His army was not a unified force, but a coalition of desperate people with different backgrounds, cultures, and objectives. The Thracians and Germans might have been willing to cross the Alps, but the Italian slaves who comprised the majority of his forces had no homeland to return to beyond the peninsula they knew. For them, the choice was between exile and conquest, and many preferred to fight for a permanent place in the land of their birth. Spartacus's decision to turn south also reflected his understanding of the broader strategic situation. Even if his army crossed the Alps, they would face uncertain reception from Gallic and Germanic tribes who might view them as competitors rather than allies. Meanwhile, Roman forces would undoubtedly pursue them beyond the mountains, continuing the conflict on terrain that favored traditional military formations over the guerrilla tactics that had served the rebellion so well in Italy. By choosing to return south, Spartacus committed his forces to a strategy of total war against Rome. This was no longer about escape or simple resistance, but about fundamentally challenging the system of slavery that supported Roman civilization. It was a decision that revealed both the nobility of his vision and the tragic impossibility of achieving it given the military and political realities of his time. The march south began well enough. Spartacus's army had grown experienced and confident through months of successful campaigning. Their tactics had evolved from the desperate improvisation of the Capua breakout to sophisticated military operations that combined gladiatorial fighting skills with the organizational knowledge of former auxiliary soldiers. They moved with the speed and coordination of professional troops while maintaining the flexibility that came from having nothing left to lose. Roman response to the rebellion's change of direction was swift and comprehensive. Crassus, who had been positioning his forces to block the Alpine passes, now found himself in pursuit of an enemy moving toward territories where Roman authority was strongest and most deeply rooted. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed, and both sides understood that the next phase of fighting would be decisive. But the rebellion's return south also triggered the arrival of new forces that would tip the balance decisively against Spartacus. Pompey the Great, fresh from his victories in Spain, was recalled to Italy with his battle-hardened legions. Simultaneously, Marcus Lucullus was summoned from campaigns in Thrace with additional troops. What had begun as a conflict between Spartacus and Crassus was evolving into a confrontation between the rebellion and the full military might of Rome. The rebels found their strategic situation deteriorating with alarming speed. Where once they had faced divided Roman forces commanded by inexperienced generals, they now confronted multiple professional armies led by Rome's most capable commanders. Their mobility, their greatest tactical advantage, was being constrained as Roman forces occupied key positions throughout southern Italy. More troubling still was the changing attitude of the Italian population. Early in the rebellion, many free peasants and urban poor had been sympathetic to the slaves' cause, seeing in it a reflection of their own economic struggles. But as the conflict dragged on and disrupted normal life, this sympathy began to erode. The rebellion that had once seemed like a romantic adventure was now threatening the stability and prosperity that even the poorest free citizens valued. As winter approached in 72 BC, Spartacus found his army increasingly isolated in the regions around Bruttium, the toe of the Italian peninsula. Crassus had constructed a massive fortification across the narrow isthmus, effectively trapping the rebels in the southern mountains. The siege of Bruttium would test every aspect of Spartacus's leadership while demonstrating the methodical efficiency that made Roman military engineering the wonder of the ancient world. The wall that Crassus built stretched from sea to sea, a distance of approximately 37 miles. It included a deep ditch, earth ramparts, and wooden palisades that created an impenetrable barrier across the rebels' path north. Behind this fortification, Roman troops waited in prepared positions while supplies arrived regularly by sea. Crassus had transformed the rebellion from a mobile campaign into a siege where Roman advantages in logistics and organization would prove decisive. For Spartacus, the siege represented both his greatest challenge and his final opportunity. Trapped in Bruttium with winter approaching, his army faced starvation, disease, and demoralization. Yet the concentration of Roman forces against him also created possibilities for the kind of decisive victory that might still change the rebellion's trajectory. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation that would determine whether the greatest slave rebellion in history would end in triumph or tragedy. The wall that Crassus constructed across the Bruttium Peninsula stands as one of the most impressive engineering achievements in Roman military history. Stretching 37 miles from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, this fortification demonstrated the systematic approach that made Roman armies so formidable when properly led and supplied. But for the 60,000 rebels trapped behind it, the wall represented something far more ominous, a massive cage designed to contain them until hunger and desperation forced them to surrender or die. The construction project revealed Crassus's understanding that traditional military tactics would be insufficient against Spartacus's unconventional forces. Throughout the rebellion, Roman armies had struggled against an enemy that refused to fight on Roman terms, preferring mobility, surprise attacks, and guerrilla warfare to the formal battles where legionary discipline and training provided decisive advantages. By building the wall, Crassus eliminated the rebels' greatest strength, their ability to choose when and where to fight. The technical specifications of Crassus's fortification were staggering. The main ditch measured 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with the excavated earth used to create ramparts topped by wooden palisades. Watchtowers positioned at regular intervals allowed Roman sentries to observe any movement along the barrier, while carefully planned camps housed the legions responsible for defending each section. Behind the main wall, Crassus established supply depots, workshops, and hospitals that transformed the siege into a long-term military operation. For Spartacus, the wall represented a crisis that tested every aspect of his leadership. His army had survived and thrived through movement and momentum, but now they found themselves trapped in increasingly desperate circumstances. The mountainous terrain of Bruttium, while defensible, could not support 60,000 people indefinitely. Food supplies dwindled as Roman naval patrols prevented seaborne relief, and the onset of winter made foraging increasingly difficult. The psychological pressure of confinement began to fracture the unity that had held the rebellion together through 2 years of campaigning. Different factions within Spartacus's army began to advocate for different solutions to their predicament. Some urged immediate attacks against the wall regardless of casualties. Others proposed negotiating with Crassus for terms that might preserve their lives, if not their freedom. Still, others suggested breaking into smaller groups that might have better chances of infiltrating Roman lines. These debates revealed the fundamental tensions that had always existed within the rebellion, but had been suppressed by the momentum of military success. Spartacus commanded men and women from dozens of different cultures and backgrounds, united only by their shared experience of slavery and their desire for freedom. Under siege, with death approaching and options dwindling, these differences began to reassert themselves in ways that threatened to destroy the army from within. The Thracian leader's response to this crisis demonstrated the qualities that had made him such an effective commander throughout the rebellion. Rather than allowing his forces to fragment into competing factions, he channeled their desperation into a systematic effort to escape their predicament. The army began probing different sections of Crassus's wall, testing for weak points and gathering intelligence about Roman defensive preparations. These reconnaissance missions revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Roman position. The wall itself was indeed impregnable to direct assault. Any attack would be channeled into killing zones where Roman artillery and disciplined infantry would slaughter rebels attempting to climb the ramparts. But the very length of the fortification created problems for its defenders. Crassus's 8 legions, while formidable in concentrated action, were stretched thin when required to defend 37 miles of barriers. Spartacus also recognized that the siege was as much a psychological battle as a physical one. His followers needed to believe that escape was possible, or despair would destroy their fighting effectiveness long before starvation killed them. He began planning not just for a single breakout attempt, but for a comprehensive deception operation that would create multiple threats simultaneously, forcing Crassus to divide his attention and resources. The plan that emerged from these preparations was characteristically bold and innovative. Rather than attempting to break through the strongest sections of the wall where Roman troops were most concentrated, Spartacus would create diversions at multiple points while his main force attempted to escape at the most unexpected location, across the sea itself. Through intermediaries, Spartacus had been negotiating with Cilician pirates who operated throughout the Mediterranean. These sea raiders had their own conflicts with Roman authority, and might be willing to provide ships in exchange for payment and shared plunder. If the rebels could reach the coast and embark before Roman naval forces could intercept them, they might still escape to Sicily or North Africa, where they could continue their fight or disperse to freedom. The negotiations with the pirates revealed another dimension of Spartacus's strategic thinking. Unlike many rebel leaders who focused exclusively on military solutions, he understood that successful revolution required diplomatic and economic initiatives as well. The pirates represented a potential ally against Roman power, while the wealth his army had accumulated through 2 years of raiding could be converted into the ships and supplies necessary for escape. But the pirate alliance also highlighted the precarious nature of the rebellion's position. These were not reliable partners, but opportunistic criminals whose loyalty extended only as far as immediate profit. The Romans, meanwhile, had their own intelligence networks, and were certainly aware of Spartacus's negotiations. Any plan that depended on external assistance carried enormous risks in a conflict where betrayal could mean death for thousands of followers. As winter deepened, the conditions inside the besieged territory deteriorated rapidly. Food became scarce, disease spread through the overcrowded camps, and morale plummeted as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Some rebels began attempting individual escapes, slipping away in small groups to seek safety or return to slavery rather than face death in a final battle. These desertions created a downward spiral that threatened to destroy the rebellion through gradual attrition rather than military defeat. Each escape attempt that succeeded encouraged others to try, while those that failed resulted in crucifixions that served as grim reminders of Roman vengeance. Spartacus found himself fighting not just Crassus, but the growing despair of his own followers. The crisis came to a head during a fierce winter storm that lashed the Bruttium Peninsula with rain, snow, and howling winds. Roman sentries seeking shelter from the weather relaxed their vigilance along sections of the wall that seemed impossible to assault under such conditions. For Spartacus, this represented exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. A moment when Roman discipline and systematic defense might be vulnerable to desperate action. The breakout attempt began on a night when the storm was so severe that visibility dropped to mere yards, and the sound of wind and rain masked the movement of large numbers of people. Using techniques learned during their gladiator training, rebel engineers had prepared fascines, bundles of sticks and brush that could be thrown into the ditch to create temporary bridges. Under cover of darkness and weather, they began moving these materials toward the weakest section of Crassus's wall. The escape succeeded, but only partially. Approximately 2/3 of Spartacus's army managed to cross the wall and break free into the Italian countryside. But the cost was enormous. Thousands died in the crossing as Roman guards discovered the attempt and fought desperately to contain it. More tragically, the army that emerged from Bruttium was no longer the unified force that had entered it. The stress of the siege had fractured the rebellion in ways that military defeat had never achieved. As dawn broke over the Bruttium Peninsula, both Spartacus and Crassus understood that the rebellion had entered its final phase. The wall had served its purpose, even though it had been breached. It had weakened the rebels, divided their forces, and eliminated their strategic mobility. Now, as the survivors scattered across southern Italy with Roman armies in pursuit, the question was whether Spartacus could reassemble his forces for one last attempt at victory, or whether the rebellion would collapse into the chaos and desperation that had claimed so many similar movements throughout history. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Spartacus and his followers, but the broader question of whether enslaved peoples could successfully challenge the foundation of Roman civilization itself. The escape from Bruttium scattered Spartacus's forces across southern Italy like seeds on the wind. But unlike seeds, they found hostile ground wherever they landed. The rebellion that had once moved with the coordination and purpose of a professional army now fragmented into desperate bands seeking safety, revenge, or simply a few more days of freedom before the inevitable end. Spartacus himself managed to maintain control over perhaps 40,000 followers, Still a formidable force by any standard, but no longer the unified movement that had terrorized Roman estates for 2 years. The siege had accomplished exactly what Crassus intended. It had broken the rebels' morale and eliminated their strategic coherence. What remained was dangerous but no longer represented an existential threat to Roman authority. The psychological impact of the breakout's partial failure rippled through the rebel ranks in ways that no military defeat had achieved. For the first time since the escape from Capua, many of Spartacus's followers began to question whether their cause was truly achievable. The wall had demonstrated Rome's capacity for systematic oppression in ways that individual battles could not. If the Republic could cage 60,000 people behind 37 miles of fortifications, what hope did any rebellion have for lasting success? These doubts manifested in increased desertion, factional disputes, and a growing reluctance among the rebels to risk themselves in major engagements. The gladiatorial corps that had provided discipline and leadership throughout the rebellion remained loyal to Spartacus, but the agricultural slaves and recent recruits who comprised the majority of his army began to fragment along ethnic, cultural, and strategic lines. Crassus, meanwhile, had learned from his earlier encounters with the rebels and adapted his tactics accordingly. Rather than pursuing Spartacus with his entire army, a strategy that had failed previous Roman commanders, he divided his forces into multiple columns that could maintain contact with different rebel groups while preventing them from reuniting. This approach sacrificed the concentrated striking power that Roman tactics traditionally emphasized, but it was perfectly suited to the new strategic situation. The Roman general also implemented a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to accelerate the rebellion's internal collapse. Captured rebels were crucified along major roads, creating forests of crosses that served as grim reminders of Roman vengeance. Rewards were offered for information about rebel movements and hideouts, encouraging betrayal from within. Most effectively, Crassus began offering amnesty to rebels who surrendered voluntarily, creating incentives for defection that proved devastatingly effective. As spring arrived in 71 BC, Spartacus found himself leading a greatly diminished force through the familiar landscapes of Campania, where the rebellion had begun. The irony was bitter. After 2 years of campaigning across Italy, he had returned to within sight of Capua and the gladiator school where his revolution had started. But the strategic situation was fundamentally different from those hopeful early days when victory had seemed possible and freedom achievable. The most serious threat to Spartacus's remaining hopes came not from Crassus, but from the approaching armies of Pompey the Great and Marcus Lucullus. These commanders, summoned from campaigns in Spain and Thrace respectively, were converging on southern Italy with fresh legions that would give Rome overwhelming numerical superiority. Once these reinforcements arrived, any possibility of military victory would disappear, leaving only the choice between death in battle and crucifixion after capture. This approaching crisis forced Spartacus to consider options that he had previously rejected as either immoral or impractical. Some of his followers urged him to seek terms with Crassus, perhaps offering to lead his remaining forces out of Italy in exchange for safe passage. Others suggested fragmenting the army entirely, allowing small groups to seek individual escape or return to slavery. Most desperately, a few voices proposed a final march on Rome itself, hoping to trigger a general uprising that might still achieve total victory. Spartacus's response to these suggestions revealed both his tactical brilliance and his fundamental integrity as a leader. He rejected any plan that would abandon his followers to Roman vengeance, understanding that his personal survival meant nothing if achieved through betraying those who had trusted him. At the same time, he refused to consider strategies that would result in pointless slaughter without any realistic possibility of success. Instead, the Thracian chose a course of action that was both strategically sound and morally consistent with the principles that had guided the rebellion from its beginning. He would seek one final decisive battle against Crassus, hoping to inflict such severe casualties that Rome might be willing to negotiate rather than continue a costly campaign. If successful, this victory might create space for his followers to escape or establish permanent settlements. If unsuccessful, they would at least die as free warriors rather than crucified slaves. The decision to seek battle rather than continue evading Roman pursuit represented a fundamental shift in Spartacus's strategic thinking. Throughout the rebellion, he had consistently avoided the kind of formal confrontation where Roman discipline and training provided decisive advantages. His greatest victories had come through surprise attacks, ambushes, and tactical innovations that nullified Roman superiority in conventional warfare. But the changed circumstances of 71 BC made these tactics increasingly impractical. His army was no longer mobile enough to execute the hit-and-run strategies that had served so well in earlier campaigns. The Roman pursuit had become too systematic and coordinated to allow for the kind of strategic deception that had characterized victories like the escape from Vesuvius. Most importantly, the approaching reinforcements meant that delay would only worsen the rebels' position. Spartacus also understood that his followers needed the psychological release that would come from striking back at their oppressors. 2 years of constant warfare had created a warrior culture among the former slaves. But the recent setbacks and growing desperation threatened to transform this martial spirit into despair and defeatism. A major battle, regardless of its outcome, would allow his people to demonstrate their courage and dignity one final time. The location Spartacus chose for this confrontation reveals his continued tactical sophistication, despite the desperate circumstances. Rather than allowing Crassus to dictate the terms of engagement, he positioned his forces near the Siler River in Lucania, where the terrain offered both defensive advantages and multiple escape routes should the battle go poorly. The river itself provided a natural obstacle that would force any Roman attack to cross water under fire from rebel positions. The surrounding hills offered elevated positions for archers and slingers, while creating difficulties for the coordinated maneuvers that were the hallmark of legionary tactics. Most importantly, the area included several mountain passes that could provide escape routes if the battle resulted in defeat rather than victory. As both armies prepared for what would be the rebellion's final battle, the broader implications of the conflict became clear to participants on both sides. This was not simply a military engagement between Romans and rebels, but a confrontation between fundamentally different visions of human society. Spartacus and his followers represented the possibility that enslaved peoples could achieve freedom through their own efforts, while Crassus embodied the Roman conviction that some people were naturally suited for domination while others were destined for submission. The stakes could not have been higher. A rebel victory might inspire uprisings throughout the Roman world, potentially threatening the entire system of slave labor that supported Mediterranean civilization. A Roman victory would not only end the immediate threat, but would serve as an object lesson to any future would-be rebels about the futility of challenging Roman authority. As the armies moved into position along the Siler River, both commanders understood that they were about to fight for more than immediate military objectives. They were contending for the future of an entire civilization, and for fundamental questions about human dignity, freedom, and power that would echo through the centuries to come. The morning mist rose from the Siler River like the breath of sleeping gods, concealing the two armies that faced each other across waters that would soon run red with blood. On the Roman side, Crassus deployed his 8 legions with the methodical precision that had made the Republic master of the Mediterranean world. His 40,000 troops stood in perfect formation, their bronze armor gleaming despite the overcast sky, their scarlet standards marking each unit's position with mathematical accuracy. Across the river, Spartacus arranged his remaining 40,000 followers in formations that blended gladiatorial techniques with the military knowledge of former auxiliary soldiers. The contrast was stark. Where Roman ranks displayed uniformity and discipline, the rebel army showed diversity and desperate determination. Former household slaves stood beside Germanic warriors while Thracian cavalry prepared to charge alongside Gallic infantry. They were united not by common origins but by shared dreams of freedom and the knowledge that this day would determine whether those dreams died with them. The battle began before dawn with the kind of calculated brutality that characterized Roman military engineering. Crassus had spent days preparing the battlefield, using his superior logistics and engineering capabilities to create advantages that would offset the rebels' desperation and fighting spirit. Roman artillery, ballistae, and scorpions capable of hurling massive bolts with devastating accuracy had been positioned overnight to command the river crossings and rebel positions. As the first light revealed the opposing armies, these siege engines opened fire with mechanical precision, sending waves of projectiles into the rebel formations. The psychological impact was immediate and intended. These weapons represented Roman technological superiority and industrial capacity in ways that individual courage could not overcome. Each bolt that tore through rebel ranks carried the message that Rome possessed resources and capabilities that no rebellion could match. Spartacus had anticipated this artillery barrage and prepared accordingly. Rather than maintaining static formations that would provide easy targets, his forces were organized in smaller, more mobile units that could disperse quickly when under fire. The rebel leader had also positioned his most experienced fighters, the original gladiators from Capua, in covered positions where they could weather the bombardment and emerge fresh for the crucial close combat that would follow. But the Thracians' most important innovation was psychological rather than tactical. Understanding that his followers faced not just military defeat but crucifixion and death, he had spent the previous night moving through the camp, speaking individually with units and commanders, reminding them of everything they had achieved and everything they still fought for. These were no longer desperate slaves seeking escape, he told them, but free warriors defending their liberty against those who would reduce them to property. The artillery bombardment continued for nearly an hour, testing the rebels' discipline and cohesion. Roman commanders watched through the morning light for signs of breaking formations or mass retreats that would signal the rebels' collapse. When these signs failed to materialize, Crassus gave the order for the general advance, launching the kind of coordinated assault that had conquered Gaul, destroyed Carthage, and subdued the Greek kingdoms of the East. The first wave of Roman legionaries approached the river in testudo formation, the famous tortoise, where interlocked shields created an impenetrable barrier against projectiles. These were veteran troops who had faced Germanic tribes, Gallic warriors, and Eastern armies, men who understood that discipline and coordination could overcome individual heroism. They advanced steadily despite taking casualties from rebel archers and slingers, maintaining formation and preparing for the river crossing that would bring them within sword range of their enemies. Spartacus allowed the Romans to begin their crossing before launching his counterattack. This decision revealed both his tactical sophistication and his understanding of his army's psychological needs. By permitting Roman forces to enter the water, he created a situation where enemy troops would be vulnerable and disordered, maximizing the impact of rebel charges. More importantly, he ensured that his followers would see Romans struggling and dying, countering the aura of invincibility that surrounded the legions. The rebel counterattack came from multiple directions simultaneously, demonstrating the coordination Spartacus had maintained despite months of retreat and declining morale. Thracian cavalry struck the Roman left flank while Germanic infantry charged their center, and Gallic warriors attempted to turn their right wing. This was not the desperate rush of doomed men but the calculated assault of experienced fighters who understood both their enemy's strengths and their own advantages. The fighting in the river itself was particularly savage, as Roman troops found themselves caught between their need to maintain formation and the chaos of crossing water under fire. The rebels, fighting on familiar ground and with nothing left to lose, pressed their attacks with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned Roman veterans. Bodies began to accumulate in the shallows, creating gruesome obstacles that further complicated the Roman advance. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed possible that Spartacus might achieve the impossible. His forces were giving better than they received. Roman formations were showing signs of strain, and panic was beginning to spread through some of the newer legions that had not yet been tested in major battles. The dream of victory that had sustained the rebellion for 2 years flickered back to life among warriors who had thought themselves doomed. But Roman military superiority was not based solely on individual courage or tactical innovation. It rested on systematic advantages: superior equipment, professional training, organized logistics, and the ability to absorb casualties that would break other armies. As the morning wore on, these advantages began to tell. Roman reserves moved forward to reinforce threatened positions, while rebel units that suffered heavy losses had no replacements available. The turning point came when Crassus himself led a charge of his elite cohorts against the rebel center, seeking to break Spartacus's line at its strongest point. This was both a tactical maneuver and a psychological statement. The Roman general was willing to risk his own life to demonstrate his confidence in victory. The attack succeeded in creating a breakthrough that allowed Roman forces to establish a foothold on the rebel side of the river. Spartacus responded with the kind of personal heroism that had inspired his followers throughout the rebellion. Fighting in the front ranks with the ferocity that had made him famous in the gladiatorial arena, he led counterattack after counterattack, seeking to close the gap in his lines before Roman reinforcements could exploit it. Ancient sources describe him cutting through enemy ranks like a force of nature, his sword work displaying the lethal artistry that had kept him alive through countless arena combats. But individual heroism, however spectacular, could not overcome the systemic advantages that Roman civilization brought to bear in moments of crisis. Fresh legions continued to cross the river as rebel units were ground down by attrition. Roman artillery, repositioned during the battle, began targeting rebel command positions with devastating accuracy. Most crucially, the rebels began to run out of the arrows, javelins, and other projectiles that had helped offset their disadvantages in armor and equipment. As afternoon approached, the battle's outcome became increasingly clear. Rebel formations that had held firm for hours began to waver and break. Units that had fought with desperate courage found themselves surrounded and cut off from mutual support. The dream of victory that had briefly seemed possible faded into the grim reality of military mathematics. Rome simply had more men, better equipment, and superior organization. Spartacus, recognizing that the battle was lost, made the decision that would define his legacy for all time. Rather than fleeing to fight another day or seeking terms that might preserve his own life, he chose to die as he had lived, as a free warrior defending those who had trusted him with their hopes and dreams. According to Plutarch, he attempted to reach Crassus himself, hoping to end the war through single combat between leaders. The Thracian never reached his target. Wounded repeatedly as he fought through Roman ranks, he was finally brought down just yards from where Crassus commanded the final assault. Even then, he continued fighting until loss of blood and overwhelming numbers made further resistance impossible. He died as he had lived throughout the rebellion, on his feet, sword in hand, facing his enemies rather than accepting their dominion. The death of Spartacus marked the effective end of organized resistance, but the slaughter continued for hours as Roman troops vented their frustrations and fears on rebels who could no longer defend themselves effectively. By evening, an estimated 60,000 bodies covered the battlefield, including virtually all of the rebellion's leadership and most of its veteran fighters. Only about 6,000 rebels survived to be captured, and their fate would serve as a final demonstration of Roman vengeance. As darkness fell over the Siler River, the greatest slave rebellion in ancient history had come to its bloody conclusion. The dream of freedom that had inspired 100,000 enslaved people to risk everything had died with Spartacus beside the waters of a small Italian river. But the example they had set, the demonstration that courage and determination could challenge even the mightiest empire, would echo through the centuries, inspiring future generations to continue the eternal human struggle for dignity and liberty. The road from Capua to Rome had witnessed many triumphs in its history. Roman generals had marched along its stone-paved length with captured enemies in chains, displaying the wealth and power of the Republic to cheering crowds. But in the spring of 71 BC, this highway became the stage for a spectacle of vengeance that would haunt the Roman imagination for generations to come. 6,000 captured rebels hung from crosses along the Appian Way, their bodies transforming the most important road in Italy into a corridor of death that stretched for over 120 miles. Crassus had ordered this mass crucifixion not merely as punishment for the survivors of Spartacus's army, but as a message to every slave in the Roman world. The crucified men were positioned so that travelers could not avoid seeing them, their slow deaths serving as a grotesque reminder of what happened to those who dared challenge Roman authority. The logistics of this massive execution revealed the same systematic efficiency that had characterized Roman military operations throughout the war. Thousands of wooden crosses had to be constructed, transported, and erected along predetermined positions. Engineers calculated spacing to maximize visibility while ensuring that the display would last for months as the bodies decomposed. The crucifixions were scheduled to occur over several days, guaranteeing that fresh agonies would replace completed deaths in a continuous cycle of suffering. For the Roman elite, this spectacle represented more than simple revenge. The Spartacus Rebellion had exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in their society that went far beyond military concerns. The uprising had demonstrated that enslaved populations could organize, fight effectively, and maintain discipline under charismatic leadership. More troubling still, it had shown that some Romans, free peasants, urban poor, and even military deserters, were willing to join such movements when economic desperation made rebellion seem preferable to continued submission. The mass crucifixion was designed to address these vulnerabilities through terror that would reach far beyond the immediate victims. Every slave who traveled the Appian Way would see the consequences of rebellion displayed in nauseating detail. Every Roman citizen would be reassured that their government possessed both the will and the capability to protect their property rights against any challenge. The message was clear. The system of slavery that supported Roman prosperity was non-negotiable and would be defended with unlimited violence. But the display also revealed deep anxieties within Roman society about the sustainability of their slave-based economy. The rebellion had disrupted agricultural production throughout southern Italy, leading to food shortages and economic losses that affected every level of society. More significantly, it had demonstrated that slave populations were not the passive property that Roman law defined them to be, but human beings capable of organization, resistance, and military effectiveness. These concerns manifested in immediate legislative and social changes designed to prevent future uprisings. The Senate passed new laws restricting slave movement and assembly, requiring stricter supervision of agricultural estates and mandating harsh punishments for any signs of rebellious activity. Wealthy Romans began investing in better security for their properties, hiring more guards and implementing surveillance systems designed to detect conspiracies before they could mature into action. The gladiatorial system, too, came under intense scrutiny following the rebellion. The schools that had produced Spartacus and his fellow conspirators were subjected to new regulations designed to prevent organized resistance. Gladiators were confined more strictly, monitored more closely, and subjected to psychological pressures intended to break any sense of solidarity that might develop among the fighters. The arena entertainment that had made gladiators famous now included additional security measures designed to prevent them from becoming symbols of resistance. Yet even as Roman authorities implemented these repressive measures, the memory of Spartacus began to take on a life of its own. Among enslaved populations throughout the Mediterranean world, the Thracian's name became synonymous with the possibility of resistance. His story spread through networks of communication that Roman surveillance could never fully penetrate, carrying messages of hope to people who had previously seen no alternative to submission. The rebellion's impact on Roman politics was equally profound, though less immediately visible. Crassus had achieved his goal of suppressing the revolt, but the victory came at enormous cost and failed to provide the kind of unambiguous triumph that advanced political careers in the Republic. The war had required years to complete, massive expenditures of money and manpower, and had culminated in a mass execution that revealed the brutality underlying Roman civilization. More problematically for Crassus, the final suppression of the rebellion had required assistance from Pompey the Great, whose legions had intercepted and destroyed the last escaping rebel bands. Pompey's intervention allowed him to claim credit for ending the war, undermining Crassus's achievement and intensifying the rivalry between these two powerful men. This competition would contribute to the political instability that eventually destroyed the Roman Republic and transformed it into an empire. The Spartacus War also influenced Roman military doctrine in ways that would have lasting consequences. The rebellion had demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics against conventional legionary formations, forcing Roman commanders to develop new strategies for dealing with unconventional opponents. These innovations would prove valuable in later campaigns against Germanic tribes, Gallic insurgents, and other enemies who refused to fight according to traditional rules of warfare. Perhaps most significantly, the rebellion forced Romans to confront fundamental questions about the nature and sustainability of their slave-based society. Intellectuals and philosophers began debating whether the institution of slavery was compatible with the moral values that Romans claimed to represent. The Stoic school in particular developed philosophical frameworks that questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying slavery, arguing that true nobility came from virtue rather than social status. These philosophical debates found their most influential expression in the writings of thinkers like Seneca, who had been born shortly before the rebellion and would spend his life grappling with its implications. Seneca's letters and essays frequently returned to questions about the treatment of slaves, the nature of freedom, and the moral obligations of those who possessed power over others. While he never explicitly condemned slavery as an institution, his writings contained arguments that would later be used by those who did. The memory of Spartacus also influenced Roman literature and historical writing in ways that reflected the complex emotions the rebellion evoked. Historians like Plutarch and Appian treated the Thracian with a respect that would have been unthinkable for other rebel leaders, acknowledging his military genius and moral courage even while condemning his challenge to Roman authority. This grudging admiration revealed a Roman capacity for recognizing virtue even in their enemies, a quality that distinguished their civilization from many others. The rebellion's impact extended far beyond the borders of Italy, inspiring resistance movements throughout the Roman world and influencing the development of revolutionary traditions that would persist for centuries. In Gaul, Germanic territories, and other frontier regions, local leaders would invoke Spartacus's example when organizing their own resistance to Roman expansion. The knowledge that slaves had successfully challenged Roman power for nearly 3 years provided hope and inspiration to subject peoples who might otherwise have accepted their subjugation as inevitable. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Spartacus Rebellion was its demonstration that ordinary people could organize effective resistance against seemingly overwhelming power. the transformation of escaped gladiators into a disciplined army that controlled large territories and defeated professional Roman forces, provided a template for future revolutionary movements. The rebellion showed that success depended not on divine intervention or exceptional circumstances, but on leadership, organization, and the willingness of oppressed people to risk everything for freedom. The crucified rebels along the Appian Way served their intended purpose for a time, terrorizing slave populations and reassuring Roman citizens that their way of life was secure. But as the bodies decomposed and the crosses eventually fell, the memory of what those men had achieved began to overshadow the horror of their deaths. They had proven that slaves could fight as effectively as citizens, that gladiators could command armies, and that the Roman Empire was not invincible when confronted by determined resistance. In the decades that followed, as the Roman Republic collapsed into civil war and transformed itself into an empire, the example of Spartacus would continue to resonate. Julius Caesar, who had been a young man during the rebellion, would later face his own slave uprisings and would remember the lessons learned from Crassus's campaign. Augustus, the first emperor, would implement policies designed to prevent future rebellions while also addressing some of the economic inequalities that had made the Spartacus revolt possible. The institution of slavery itself would gradually evolve in response to the rebellion's demonstration of its inherent instabilities. While slavery remained central to Roman society for centuries, the most brutal aspects of the system were moderated as owners recognized the dangers of driving their human property to desperation. The gladiatorial games, too, would eventually be abolished as Christian emperors came to power and rejected the values that had made such entertainment acceptable. Yet the most enduring legacy of Spartacus and his followers was not in the immediate changes they forced upon Roman society, but in their demonstration that human dignity could not be permanently suppressed through violence and oppression. The rebellion proved that even the most systematic forms of dehumanization could not entirely extinguish the desire for freedom, and that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage when fighting for principles that transcended their individual survival. The road from Capua to Rome would witness many more spectacles in the centuries that followed. Triumphal processions, imperial ceremonies, and the slow transformation of the ancient world. But travelers along that route would long remember the spring when 6,000 crosses stood as monuments to both the cruelty of power and the courage of those who dared to challenge it. In death, the followers of Spartacus had achieved something that their lives of slavery had denied them. They had become symbols of human dignity that no amount of Roman vengeance could destroy. The true measure of Spartacus's impact on history cannot be found in the immediate aftermath of his defeat, but in the ways his example continued to inspire and challenge future generations, long after the last cross had fallen along the Appian Way. The rebellion that began in a gladiator school in Capua had unleashed ideas and demonstrated possibilities that would echo through the centuries, influencing everything from political philosophy to revolutionary strategy to our modern understanding of human rights and dignity. In the immediate decades following the rebellion, Roman society underwent subtle but significant changes that reflected the lasting impact of Spartacus's challenge. The treatment of slaves, while remaining brutal by modern standards, was gradually moderated as owners recognized the dangers of driving human property to absolute desperation. The legal system developed new protections for slaves against the most extreme forms of abuse, not from humanitarian concern but from practical recognition that systematic brutality created security risks for the entire society. The gladiatorial system in particular was transformed by the memory of the rebellion. New security measures made escape virtually impossible, while psychological techniques were developed to break the sense of solidarity that had enabled Spartacus's conspiracy. Yet these very measures acknowledged the power of the example he had set, that even the most oppressed people could organize effective resistance if they found appropriate leadership and maintain their sense of human dignity. The political ramifications of the Spartacus War extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The rebellion had demonstrated that Roman power, while vast, was not unlimited, and that the Republic's wealth and security depended on maintaining the consent, however grudging, of subject populations. This lesson would influence Roman policy toward conquered territories for generations, leading to more sophisticated approaches to imperial administration that combined coercion with incentives for cooperation. Perhaps more significantly, the rebellion forced Roman intellectuals to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of slavery, freedom, and human dignity that their society had previously avoided. The Stoic philosophers, in particular, developed increasingly sophisticated arguments about the moral status of enslaved people that would eventually contribute to slavery's abolition in later centuries. Writers like Seneca, Epictetus, himself a former slave, and Marcus Aurelius created philosophical frameworks that emphasized virtue and character rather than social status as the true measures of human worth. These philosophical developments had practical consequences that extended throughout the Roman world. While slavery remained legal and widespread, the intellectual foundation that supported it was gradually eroded by arguments that had been sparked in part by the example of Spartacus and his followers. The rebellion had forced Romans to confront the uncomfortable reality that their slaves were human beings capable of courage, organization, and moral choice, qualities that their society claimed to value above all others. The influence of Spartacus's example can be traced through subsequent resistance movements throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. In Britain, Boudicca's rebellion against Roman rule drew inspiration from earlier examples of successful resistance to imperial power. In Judea, the various Jewish revolts employed tactics and strategies that reflected knowledge of how slaves had challenged Roman authority. Even in distant Gaul and Germania, tribal leaders organizing resistance to Roman expansion invoked the memory of those who had proven that Rome could be defeated. The documentation and preservation of Spartacus's story by Roman historians like Plutarch, Appian, and others reflects the complex attitudes that developed toward the rebellion over time. While these writers condemned the challenge to Roman authority, they also expressed grudging admiration for Spartacus's military genius, moral courage, and leadership abilities. This acknowledgement of virtue in an enemy was characteristically Roman, but it also helped ensure that the gladiators' example would survive to inspire future generations. During the medieval period, when slavery in its classical form had largely disappeared from Europe, the story of Spartacus was preserved and transmitted through various channels. Christian writers, many of whom were themselves critical of oppressive social systems, found in the gladiators' example a powerful illustration of the dignity of common people and the possibility of resistance to unjust authority. While they were careful to avoid explicitly endorsing rebellion against legitimate government, they preserved the memory of those who had fought for freedom against overwhelming odds. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought renewed attention to Spartacus and his rebellion, as humanist scholars explored ancient sources for examples of virtue, courage, and moral excellence. The gladiator's story was reinterpreted through the lens of Renaissance values that emphasized individual achievement and the capacity of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. This period saw the first modern artistic representations of Spartacus, including paintings and literary works that celebrated his courage while avoiding explicit political commentary. The Age of Enlightenment transformed Spartacus into a symbol of natural rights and human dignity that transcended the specific historical circumstances of his rebellion. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau invoked his example when arguing for the inherent equality of all human beings and the illegitimacy of systems based on hereditary privilege. The gladiator who had died beside the Siler River became a powerful argument for the revolutionary potential of oppressed peoples and the moral necessity of resistance to tyranny. This philosophical transformation reached its climax during the French Revolution, when Spartacus became an explicit symbol of popular resistance to aristocratic oppression. Revolutionary leaders invoked his name and example when justifying their own challenge to established authority, while artists and writers created works that celebrated the rebellion as a precursor to their own struggle for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The ancient gladiator had become a modern revolutionary hero, whose example could inspire contemporary movements for social change. The 19th century brought new interpretations of Spartacus that reflected the era's concerns with industrial capitalism, worker organizing, and the struggle for social justice. Karl Marx and other socialist theorists found in the rebellion an early example of class struggle that anticipated their own analyses of economic oppression and revolutionary potential. The gladiator who had united enslaved people against their masters became a symbol of the working class's capacity to organize against capitalist exploitation. In the 20th century, Spartacus's story was repeatedly adapted to address contemporary political concerns. During World War II, resistance fighters against fascist occupation forces invoked his example as proof that seemingly hopeless struggles could succeed against overwhelming odds. The Cold War period saw competing interpretations of his legacy, with both communist and capitalist societies claiming him as a symbol of their own values and aspirations. Perhaps most significantly, the civil rights movement in the United States drew explicit inspiration from Spartacus's example of dignified resistance to systematic oppression. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. found in the ancient rebellion a powerful illustration of the moral necessity of challenging unjust systems even at great personal cost. The gladiators' demonstration that oppressed people could organize effective resistance provided both practical lessons and inspirational example for those fighting against racial segregation and discrimination. The modern human rights movement continues to invoke Spartacus as a symbol of the universal desire for freedom and dignity. His story has been adapted and retold countless times in books, films, and other media, each generation finding new relevance in the ancient tale of slaves who dared to challenge the world's greatest empire. The specific details of his rebellion may be distant from contemporary concerns, but the fundamental questions it raised about power, resistance, and human dignity remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The scholarly study of the Spartacus Rebellion has also evolved significantly, reflecting changes in historical methodology and political consciousness. Modern historians have moved beyond simply celebrating or condemning the revolt to examine its social, economic, and cultural contexts in sophisticated ways. Archaeological evidence has provided new insights into the material conditions that made the rebellion possible, while anthropological approaches have illuminated the complex process by which diverse enslaved populations were forged into a unified resistance movement. Contemporary scholarship has also emphasized the rebellion's significance as a moment when alternative forms of social organization became visible within the Roman world. The brief existence of Spartacus's army created a space where former slaves could experience dignity, equality, and self-determination in ways that their previous lives had never allowed. This temporary liberation provided a glimpse of possibilities that would not be fully realized for centuries, but that demonstrated the human capacity for creating more just and equitable societies. The technological revolution of the 21st century has brought new opportunities to explore and understand the Spartacus Rebellion. Digital reconstructions of ancient battlefields, sophisticated analysis of historical sources, and improved archaeological techniques have all contributed to a more complete picture of what the rebels achieved and how they accomplished it. These tools have also made the story more accessible to global audiences, ensuring that Spartacus's example continues to inspire new generations of people struggling for freedom and justice. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of Spartacus's enduring legacy is not in the specific details of his military campaigns or political strategies, but in his demonstration that ordinary people possess extraordinary capacities for courage, organization, and moral choice. The slave who became a gladiator, who became a revolutionary leader, embodied possibilities that exist within every human being, the potential to transcend circumstances, challenge injustice, and fight for principles that extend beyond individual survival. In our own era, as societies around the world grapple with questions of inequality, oppression, and the proper relationship between power and justice, the example of Spartacus remains powerfully relevant. His rebellion reminds us that systems of domination, however entrenched they may seem, are ultimately dependent on the cooperation or acquiescence of those they oppress. When that cooperation is withdrawn, when people choose dignity over safety, freedom over security, even the mightiest empires can be shaken to their foundations. The gladiator who died fighting beside the Siler River could never have imagined that his name would still be spoken with reverence more than 2 millennia after his death. But the principles he embodied, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, loyalty to those who trusted him, and the conviction that human dignity is worth any sacrifice. These are timeless values that speak to something fundamental in the human spirit. In every generation that has faced oppression and injustice, someone has remembered Spartacus and found in his example the courage to resist, to organize, and to fight for a better world. This is perhaps the truest measure of his victory. Though he lost the war and died in defeat, Spartacus achieved something far more significant than military success. He proved that the human desire for freedom cannot be permanently crushed through violence and oppression, and that ordinary people possess the capacity for extraordinary courage when fighting for principles larger than themselves. These lessons, learned on the battlefields of ancient Italy, continue to inspire and guide all those who believe that a better world is possible and worth fighting for. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most remarkable episodes, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of ancient Rome and the gladiator who dared to challenge its power. The story of Spartacus forces us to examine fundamental aspects of human nature, social organization, and the eternal tension between those who seek to dominate and those who refuse to be dominated. The rebellion that began in a gladiator school in Capua reveals truths about human resilience that transcend any particular historical period. Spartacus and his followers were not superhuman heroes, but ordinary people who found within themselves extraordinary reserves of courage, determination, and moral clarity when faced with circumstances that demanded nothing less than total commitment. Their example suggests that such capacities exist within all human beings, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of leadership, opportunity, and desperate necessity. Yet the rebellion also demonstrates the tragic limitations that constrain even the most heroic human efforts. Despite achieving military victories that shocked the ancient world, despite uniting diverse populations in common cause, despite creating alternative forms of social organization that prefigured more just societies, Spartacus and his followers ultimately failed to achieve their goals of permanent freedom. Their defeat reminds us that individual courage and moral clarity, however inspiring, may not be sufficient to overcome systemic inequalities supported by vast disparities in resources, organization, and institutional power. This tension between the possibilities revealed by human courage and the constraints imposed by structural realities runs throughout the Spartacus story and gives it much of its enduring power. The rebellion succeeded in ways that seemed impossible, transforming desperate slaves into disciplined soldiers, creating unity among diverse populations, challenging the military might of Rome itself. But it also failed in ways that seem inevitable when viewed through the lens of historical analysis. Lacking the economic base necessary for sustained resistance, unable to overcome the technological and organizational advantages of an established empire, doomed by the very diversity that had been its initial strength. The Roman response to the rebellion reveals equally complex truths about the nature of power and its exercise. The mass crucifixion along the Appian Way was not simply an expression of sadistic cruelty, but a calculated political strategy designed to address real vulnerabilities in the Roman system. The spectacle of suffering was intended to restore psychological equilibrium to a society that had been profoundly shaken by the demonstration that its foundational assumptions about slavery and social hierarchy could be successfully challenged. Yet even as Roman authorities sought to erase the rebellion's influence through terror and repression, they were forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of many concerns that had motivated the revolt. The gradual moderation of slavery's worst abuses, the development of more sophisticated approaches to imperial administration, and the emergence of philosophical frameworks that questioned traditional justifications for oppression all reflected the lasting impact of Spartacus's challenge to Roman civilization. The preservation and transmission of the Spartacus story through subsequent centuries reveals something equally significant about human psychology and collective memory. Despite every incentive to forget or minimize the rebellion's significance, successive generations found in it something too valuable to lose, a demonstration that resistance was possible, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, and that the desire for freedom represented something fundamental in human nature that could not be permanently suppressed. This process of memory and reinterpretation has continued into our own era, where the figure of Spartacus has been adapted to address contemporary concerns about social justice, economic inequality, and the proper relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities. Each generation has found new relevance in the ancient story, suggesting that it speaks to concerns that transcend any particular political or economic system. The rebellion's influence on subsequent resistance movements throughout history demonstrates both the power and the limitations of inspirational examples. Knowledge that slaves had successfully challenged Roman authority provided hope and strategic insights to future revolutionary movements, but it could not guarantee their success or prevent them from making similar mistakes. The example of Spartacus inspired countless acts of courage and resistance, but it could not overcome the structural challenges that each movement faced in its own specific historical context. Perhaps most importantly, the Spartacus Rebellion forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own society and our own complicity in systems of oppression. While few of us live in societies that practice slavery in its classical form, most of us benefit from economic and political arrangements that create vast inequalities and limit opportunities for the most vulnerable members of our communities. The example of ancient slaves who risked everything for freedom challenges us to examine our own willingness to accept injustice when challenging it would require personal sacrifice. The rebellion also raises questions about the effectiveness of different strategies for social change. Spartacus chose armed resistance after concluding that peaceful methods could not achieve the fundamental transformation he sought. His example has inspired countless revolutionary movements, but it has also been criticized by those who argue that violence inevitably corrupts even the most noble causes, and that lasting change can only be achieved through peaceful means. These debates reflect deeper philosophical questions about the nature of justice, the legitimacy of revolutionary violence, and the proper balance between individual rights and social stability. The Spartacus story provides no easy answers to these questions, but it does demonstrate the human capacity for moral courage in circumstances that offer no perfect choices. Only the option to act according to one's deepest convictions despite uncertain outcomes and enormous personal risks. The enduring fascination with Spartacus also reflects something profound about human psychology and our relationship to heroic narratives. Despite living in an era of unprecedented prosperity and individual freedom, People continue to find inspiration in the story of ancient slaves who died fighting for liberty. This suggests that material comfort and political rights, however valuable, do not fully satisfy human aspirations for meaning, dignity, and transcendent purpose. The rebellion's ultimate failure, paradoxically, may be part of what makes it so compelling to contemporary audiences. Spartacus and his followers achieved moral victory through their willingness to risk everything for principles larger than themselves, even though they failed to achieve their practical objectives. Their example suggests that some things, dignity, freedom, loyalty to one's convictions, are worth pursuing regardless of the likelihood of success. This understanding of heroism differs significantly from modern notions that tend to emphasize successful outcomes over moral quality. The Spartacus story reminds us that true nobility may consist not in winning, but in fighting for what is right regardless of the odds. A message that speaks to anyone who has ever faced circumstances that seem to offer only the choice between submission and principled resistance. The Gladiators' Rebellion also illuminates the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces that shape human possibilities. Spartacus was clearly an exceptional leader whose personal qualities were essential to the rebellion's achievements, but he was also the product of historical circumstances that made such a figure necessary and possible. His story suggests that history is shaped by the interaction between individual choice and structural conditions, that great changes require both the right circumstances and the right people willing to act upon them. As we consider the legacy of Spartacus and his followers, we are ultimately confronted with questions about our own responsibilities and opportunities. Do we live in an era that demands similar courage from those who recognize injustice and inequality? What forms should such courage take in circumstances very different from those faced by ancient slaves? How can we honor the memory of those who sacrificed everything for freedom while avoiding the romantic glorification of violence and suffering? These questions have no simple answers, but the example of Spartacus suggests that they cannot be avoided by anyone who takes seriously the ideals of human dignity and justice. The rebellion that began in a gladiator school and ended beside the Siler River reminds us that such ideals are not abstract philosophical concepts, but lived realities that require courage, sacrifice, and commitment from each generation that hopes to preserve and extend them. The story of Spartacus ultimately transcends the specific historical circumstances that gave it birth. It speaks to universal human experiences of oppression and resistance, of the search for dignity and meaning in circumstances that seem designed to deny both. Most importantly, it demonstrates that ordinary people possess extraordinary capacities for courage and moral action when confronted with challenges that demand nothing less than their complete commitment to principles larger than themselves. In our own time, as in every era, there are those who suffer under systems of oppression and those who benefit from them. There are those who accept injustice as inevitable and those who insist that it can be changed. The example of Spartacus reminds us that the choice between these positions is not simply a matter of political opinion, but a fundamental decision about what kind of people we choose to be and what kind of world we choose to create. The gladiator who died fighting for freedom more than 2,000 years ago left us not just a story, but a challenge. To live with the courage and integrity that we admire in others, to resist systems that dehumanize and oppress, and to work for a world where the dignity and potential that Spartacus embodied can be realized by all people. This is perhaps the truest victory that emerged from the tragedy beside the Siler River, not the military success that eluded the rebels, but the inspiration that continues to move human hearts toward justice, freedom, and the recognition that every person possesses inherent worth that no system of oppression can ultimately destroy. Reflecting on this journey through Roman history, several questions emerge that connect ancient struggles to our modern world. Do you think Rome's resilience was born of discipline or luck? The empire's ability to suppress the Spartacus Rebellion revealed both its systematic strengths and its fundamental vulnerabilities, suggesting that sustainable power requires more than military might alone. Which Roman leader do you think left the strongest legacy? While figures like Caesar and Augustus shaped political institutions, leaders like Marcus Aurelius influenced philosophical thought, and even Spartacus, technically Rome's enemy, inspired ideals of human dignity that transcended his defeat. What lesson from Rome feels most relevant today? Perhaps it's the recognition that even the mightiest systems depend on the consent or acquiescence of those they govern, and that the human desire for freedom and dignity cannot be permanently suppressed through force alone. The story of Spartacus reminds us that history is shaped not just by emperors and generals, but by ordinary people who choose courage over comfort, principle over survival, and hope over despair. Their example continues to illuminate the path toward justice and human dignity, challenging each generation to determine what ideals are worth fighting for and what sacrifices we're willing to make to achieve them.